So the topic of this presentation today is making housing fair, housing policy and racial segregation in the RVA region. But my understanding is that over the last couple of weeks, you all have been kind of learning about the role that housing plays as it relates to really understanding inequity, both in Richmond, but really in a broader sense. So one of the things that I want to spend some time, I'll spend about 30 minutes talking, and then I'll open it up to questions from you, is thinking about a lot of times when we think about the inequities that we see in the built environment and in housing and in inequality and our access to opportunity. A lot of times we think of it as a series of individual choices, right? People choosing to either live in segregated communities or choosing to, go to certain schools, choosing, etc. But in fact, and what I hope, as you are kind of hearing this presentation and others, that you start to learn is that the inequities that we see today are tied to a long history of intentional public policy that have created the segregation in the neighborhoods and communities that we see today. And so I'd like to do a pretty kind of broad overview of specific federal and local housing policies that really, connect us to the health inequities that we see today. And then I'll close by just highlighting, well, what's the impact? What has been the impact of this long-term housing policy on housing equity, on access to opportunity, either educational, employment, transportation, etc. And so I'll start with the myth of de facto segregation. So one of the things that is always interesting to me is that when we think about how we got here today in a kind of current context, at looking at the housing inequality that we see today, it's really easy to write it off as individual agency, right? Individuals made choices to move to the neighborhoods that they did, right? Like white folk made choices to kind of get up and go and say, I don't want to live around Black people, people of color. And in some ways that's true, right? Just because of, the history of racism in this country. But I think it's really important to understand that a lot of the housing segregation, residential segregation that we see today is really was supported by government actions, intentional government actions that were rolled out statewide, federal level, and locally that really promoted, white communities being better invested in and communities of color being disinvested in or not invested in at all, right? So it's kind of those individual choices were supported by, government systems that enacted laws and policies that made it so communities were intentionally segregated. So I wanted to kind of lay that out as I am going over the history of federal housing policy. And so there are a few things that I'll touch on today, starting with the development of the Federal Housing Administration dating back to 1934. The Homeowner Loan Corporation, which for those of you who have ever seen a redlining map, which I'll show a few, this was the organization that was essentially responsible for grading neighborhoods based on their worthiness to be backed by federal loans. And what happened in almost all instances, this is not unique to Richmond, is that neighborhoods with people of color, with African Americans, were almost always rated red, right? That's where we get the term redlining. So I'll talk about that. Transition into talking about the history of public housing development in the United States as well, and how it reinforced our segregation in housing that we see today. Urban renewal, Brown v. Board of Education, which obviously wasn't intentionally about or specifically a housing policy, but obviously led to more segregated housing. And then I'll end by discussing the Federal Highway Act. This is in no way kind of a comprehensive overview of all of the policy interventions that have led to disparities in housing, but I do think it gives you a really good picture of, again, the intentional public policy efforts that were made that leads us to kind of where we are today. So Great Depression, 1930s, unemployment is high, unemployment rate about 25%. And the country is really looking for a way to re-stimulate the economy. People are needing jobs, people are in dire poverty. And so housing really becomes the industry that is used to rebuild the economy. Not only in terms of providing, jobs for construction, but you start to see an entire industry built that essentially kind of feeds itself and allows the country to kind of recover from the Great Depression. One of the things that come out of, this series of recovery policies after the Great Depression is the development of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. Many of you who may be homeowners or know someone who owns a home, FHA is actually a type of loan that you can get. And so the Federal Housing Administration was developed to ensure mortgage loans made by banks. And some of the language that was specifically built into this policy was in and of itself like discriminatory. And, it was a policy created and administration, built in a time of, racism in this country. And it's one of the things that it said is if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. So you see that at kind of from the start, the creation of the FHA codified this idea and planted the seeds for kind of segregationist housing policies. One of the things that kind of came out of, recovery after the Great Depression, FHA, was also the development of the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1933. And they were a group that was essentially assigned to really assessing the value of certain neighborhoods to make sure that, FHA was insuring loans in the correct types of neighborhoods. And so one of the biggest things that they did was they were the institution that was responsible essentially for institutionalizing practices like redlining through creating something called residential security maps, which we now commonly know as redlining maps, right? And so this is a redlining map from the city of Richmond. And so green and blue were essentially neighborhoods where FHA said, we don't mind, backing loans here. There's enough white people who live in these areas and these communities that we trust that, it is worth the investment. Once you started to get to, the yellows and the reds specifically, the redlining neighborhoods, those were the communities that had, enough of people of color that, the HOLC essentially said, this is not worth the investment. This is not worth, we don't feel secure in you providing and ensuring loans in these areas, hence leading to communities that were redlined, which means that these were places that, these were neighborhoods and communities where people of color did not have the opportunity to access home ownership opportunities, which when we, translate that today, and just in terms of this country, the number one way that we build wealth is through home ownership and equity in our home ownership. So you can imagine that when we talk about gaps in wealth building and the white gaps in home ownership between white households and Black households, why that gap is so huge really is linked to policies that were developed in the 30s. And so this is just were hot spots where, where mortgage lenders were willing to loan the maximum amount for loans. B, not desirable, but still good. C, it had reached its transition period, which means there was a language used, there was an infiltration of lower grade population i.e. people of color. And then D, it had declined, and therefore those neighborhoods were not worthy of getting loans. So I'll skip this because this is just kind of another example of in the city of Richmond. So when we think about access to opportunity today, one of the places I think we always speak to in the city's context is the East End of Richmond. And so it is no surprise that also when you look at this map, when you look at the original residential security map, there is a direct connection between the areas that were redlined and the areas where we see the highest rate of poverty, the lowest median household income, the schools that don't receive the maximum amount of funding, where we see our food deserts, where we see lack of access to adequate transportation, etc. Fast forward to 1934, this was a federal policy that essentially established the public housing program, later kind of transitioned into specific cities having, housing authorities as well. But even in the creation of policies that created public housing, they were largely built in undesirable location, very high density, folks crammed on top of each other. And the income requirements that were created ensured that only low-income residents would really would be able to qualify, thereby increasing the concentration of poverty in public housing. And so this is an example of a map from, again, the city of Richmond, where you can kind of start to see. So Windsor Farms, which we know today is a pretty well-off neighborhood, huge homes, but also higher median household income households, in relation to, again, the red line neighborhoods where you have a higher density and higher amount of public housing. And as we know, just from being in the city or learning the city, the East End has the highest concentration. That is where 5 out of the 6 of your public housing developments are in the city of Richmond as well. And so, another important policy to highlight, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill, which gave vets the opportunity to also gain access to home ownership throughout the country. 11 million, and I always find this stat so interesting, 11 million Americans purchased homes through FHA and Veteran Affairs. Less than 2% of those mortgages went to African Americans. So again, a policy where you see the intentional exclusion of African American households of color being able to access home ownership opportunities. Brown v. Board Education in 1954. What we know is that this declared state law, which desegregated public schools, but as a result of that, what you saw was white flight. So white folks who had lived in the city essentially dispersing into the counties, dispersing into the suburbs as a direct result of that policy. And as a direct result of white flight, you start to see the building of suburbs, but as a way to, ensure that folks can get to those communities outside of the city. 1956, we see the Federal Aid Highway Act, and it essentially authorized funding for the construction of 41,000 miles of the interstate highway system. And where they built these highways, there were communities, folks lived there. And of course, they were often, actually 9 times out of 10, they were often built through African-American neighborhoods and African-American communities. But it essentially, this policy indirectly subsidized the development of white suburbs at the expense of Black neighborhoods and Black communities. In the city of Richmond, if you are ever on like 95, you'll see that one of the structures that remains was 6 Mount Zion Baptist Church that you can kind of actually see, I think, when you're driving south, right? This was a neighborhood in 1956, the 800 block of St. Paul and Duval Street. And so you can kind of see the before and after of, after, they were, these communities, these predominantly African-American communities were essentially bulldozed through to create the highway system that many of us drive on if we have access to a vehicle. And this is just another example of what it looks like when that was cleared. And so bringing it to a local context, I do think it's also important to highlight that in conjunction with these things happening on the federal level, there were also things happening on the city level. 1911, Richmond adopted a residential segregation ordinance. 1912, the Virginia General Assembly, which is the state's legislature, passed legislation permitting all cities and towns to also adopt residential segregation ordinances. 1915, the Virginia Supreme Court in Hopkins v. City of Richmond, they upheld that it was perfectly legal for the city to maintain its residential segregation. It wasn't until 1917 in Buchanan v. Warley that residential segregation ordinances became unconstitutional. 1920s, the 1924, the Virginia General Assembly passed the bill to Preserve Racial Integrity Act. So if you've seen the Lovings or something, which essentially bans, mixed race couples, which also became a kind of another way of ensuring residential segregation as well. And restrictive covenants. So these covenants were essentially language written into home deeds to make sure that if a home was sold or passed down, that it had to, only be passed down to another white person, right? It could not be passed down to someone of any other race. And what's interesting is that even though restrictive covenants were deemed unconstitutional in 1948, there are many deeds that still have this language, even though it obviously is not enforceable. And so, interestingly, this past General Assembly session, for those who are into kind of public policy, there was a law passed that makes it easier for folks to remove restrictive covenant language from their deeds, because it was kind of not necessarily a difficult process, but kind of working to get that language out wasn't as easy as it should have been. So again, things like restrictive covenants ensured that African Americans, other communities of color, were not able to move into certain communities and certain neighborhoods. And so what's the legacy of this, right? So we highlighting all of this policy, but how has it really affected housing, but access to opportunity today? And so obviously we see this redlining map, and I just want to show this again, because I'll go through a series of maps really quickly, and I want you to see kind of how they line up with regard to where we see the highest rates of poverty, where we see the highest rates of folks who don't have access to certain opportunities and resources. This one is the development, again, of public housing. And so side by side, it is a map of a redlining map of Richmond. And then you start to see the public housing that was developed in the city of Richmond between the 1930s and the 1960s are all in also previously redlined communities. Poverty and public housing development. If we look at rates of households where children are living in poverty, and then just kind of in general, where we see the highest rates of poverty in the city of Richmond. So it's really like this darker brown that you're seeing on the screen. You can also line that up with previously redlined communities. Similar story for if we break it down by race. So African-American households living below the poverty level, non-Hispanic whites households living below the poverty level, and Hispanic and Latino households below the poverty level. And so what you can see again in the East End, we have the higher rates of poverty for African Americans and Hispanic households. Not surprisingly, as you start to get toward the West End, which, anecdotally, for those who know the city of Richmond or who are getting familiar, is where you tend to see lower poverty rates. median household income. Again, higher when you get toward the west end of the city, so the darker brown, and lower as you get toward the east end of the city. And again, directly aligns with the redlining maps that were made in the 1930s for the city. And then racial disparities in eviction. So, Richmond really got put on the radar, kind of got put in the spotlight for our eviction crisis in 2016 when Matthew Desmond published Evicted. And so one of the things that, became abundantly clear is that, eviction is really the color of eviction, right? Is that one of the pieces of research that we're doing at home is looking at kind of the racial disparities in eviction. And so the UDR by block group map, that shows the rate of unlawful detainers filed by block group in the city of Richmond. And essentially what that is an unlawful detainer filed by a landlord is kind of the first step in a household getting evicted. And so you can kind of see that the highest rates of UDR filed, again, the kind of darker brown areas, tend to be in either the south side of Richmond or in the east end. And when you line that up with the percent of renter householders that are also African American, again, you can start to see the disparities in that as well. Similar to food access, which I think directly relate to, the work that you all do being in the health profession and thinking about how our discriminatory housing policies have also impacted, folks' ability to not even be able to access, a conventional grocery store and therefore not be able to access healthy foods and vegetables. So thinking about the disparities in food access to this in the city of Richmond. So I live in the West End, and I think about the fact that I can get to probably literally 3 or 4 grocery stores. And there are folks in the city who they can walk to one, but have to plan for it because it takes a while. And that's if there's proper transportation infrastructure, there's proper sidewalks for them to be able to do that. And then also looking at foreclosures. So even in communities that have been able to access home ownership opportunities, this is a map of foreclosures between 2005 and 2017 in the city of Richmond, kind of, at the end of the 2008 crisis, and looking at the households and communities that had the highest rates of foreclosures in the city of Richmond, which, losing your home can often put a household in kind of this cycle of poverty and houselessness, etc. And then I think this map it's always been really relevant, but especially relevant considering the times around just social justice movements on policing. This is a map that takes a year's worth of data and looks at where pedestrian stops are done in the city, right? So again, you can start to see the concentration of those pedestrian stops in previously redlined neighborhoods. So the fact that communities of color are hyper surveilled and over policed by RPD. And so how does this impact, what are the impacts on our health, right? So if we can think about the places we lived growing up or just throughout our lives into adulthood, it's this idea that your environment is really important in determining kind of outcomes, right? And that's everything from, are you able to access healthcare? Are you able to access transportation and be mobile? Are you able to exercise? Are you near community support systems? And these determinants of health are really structural factors that kind of intersect with each other that really affect our ability to kind of be successful, to thrive, but to also be healthy. And I'm sure many of you are kind of aware of this, but when we think about these social determinants of health, it ranges from everything from economic stability to the physical environment of your neighborhood, to education, to food, to, community and social context. And one of the things I want to point out is how housing is so crucial and instrumental in being able to access literally all of these things. Where I live directly impacts the type of employment I'm able to access. do I live in a community where, do I have access to transportation so I can, literally commute to higher paying jobs? Do I have stable housing? Do I live in a community that is walkable? Do I live in a community that has greenery and pocket parks where I can be active? Do I live in a community where my schools are underfunded? Do I live in a community where, again, I can access, healthy food options? Do I live in a community where I have, social support systems that exist for me to, be able to, to be successful? And again, because of the way housing was constructed in this country, you can kind of see that all of these things that determine how healthy we are as human beings are tied to, where we live. And so I do want to make sure we have some time for questions. I think this deck will be provided to you. So I'm going to kind of go through these last slides and then open it up. But housing, right? It determines our ability to access mainstream credit. Determines, because you literally have credit deserts where folks do not live near traditional banks, right? So I think we take for granted that we may live near the Wells Fargo and the Bank of America and the credit union, but there are communities where the only thing they have access to are like payday loans, payday lenders, which thankfully, have been, there's been some legislation to make sure that that's not the case. Housing affects our quality of schools. It affects the adequacy of our transportation systems and networks, our job opportunities, whether or not our community is stable, and then again, our access to healthcare. So I'm gonna skip past some of this and end with a map of opportunity. So it's called an opportunity indices, where you can essentially map where opportunity is very high and where opportunity is very low. And some of the things that they consider in this kind of opportunity indices is, living X amount of miles from, health, being able to access healthcare, the quality of schools, and high paying employment opportunities, many of the things we talked about in kind of that diagram. And so this is just a map that kind of lays out where in the Richmond region, because this takes in Richmond, Henrico, and Chesterfields, where opportunity is high. So again, those darker brown areas, and where opportunity is very low, the yellow and orange area. And what it does is it overlays that with where the population is 75% or more minority or 75% or more white. And so I would like to point you to kind of this middle Richmond region, where we can again start to see that we see the lowest kind of opportunity indices also in neighborhoods that tend to be more minority. Whereas as we get out to the counties, and that's changing a bit, just as folks are, poverty, there are pockets of poverty coming up in our counties and suburbs as well. But you start to see kind of more gray, 75% or more whites, in areas where there are higher opportunity indices. And so with that, I would like to close by saying here is, and again, this will be sent around to you, but here is my contact information, also my office phone number. Please feel free to reach out if you have additional questions about any of the research we're doing, or if you have questions specifically about this presentation. I very much look forward to engaging with students around this, especially for folks that may be like new to the city and trying to just learn, about how the city has really been impacted by housing policy. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen to see if folks have any questions for me, or thoughts, or, just observations from your own work about, what this looks like day to day.
Thank you, Mariah. That was great. We really appreciate you spending your time and expertise with us today. Folks, if you would just type your questions into the chat. And I was going to start out and ask, can you expand a little bit more about the opportunities of that last slide? What would be an opportunity? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, so this idea of opportunity, I often think about it as kind of like, again, and I always pose it of like, think of where you live and you step outside your porch or your stoop or wherever it is. And if you're able to kind of look up and around you, what are the things that you're seeing? Right? Like, what are those things that you're able to access that really impact the quality of your life in terms of systems, right? And so do you have the opportunity for, gainful employment that kind of expands beyond minimum wage or low paying jobs? Do you have the opportunity to access, adequate and affordable health care? Do you have the opportunity to attend a high quality and performing school? Do you have the opportunity to, access transportation either through, your personal vehicle, or is there transportation infrastructure? And even if there is transportation infrastructure, is it easy for you to get from point A to point B without having to plan your whole day around it? And so it's important to think about like how we live literally becomes the foundation for being able. There are communities that are kind of overfunded and, have all of the opportunity. And then on the other end of the spectrum where none of those things exist. And so there was a stat that I wrote down where it was 71% of minorities living in segregated minority communities live in an area with a life expectancy of 62 years or less, whereas only 9% of whites living in a segregated white community live in a community where their life expectancy is 62 years or less, right? And so you start to see like how those material conditions impact how long we are on this earth. Does that answer your question, Logan?
Yes, thank you. And I thought it was very interesting that you highlighted Gilpin Court and Westover Hills, because there is a life expectancy map that demonstrates that there's a 20-year difference between these two neighborhoods.
Yep. Absolutely. I think, Deshonda, can you discuss the legislation that has been acted to reverse discriminatory housing laws and who is supposed to be enforcing them? What are the consequences for those who continue to include discriminatory language and policy? Deshonda, I'll speak to a few, and I would love to talk with you offline about this, because I think that, in general, Virginia's General Assembly is moving in a really great direction for reversing some of this. But I think from a discriminatory housing laws perspective, I will start with home. So at the core of our organization, when we started in 1971, we are a fair housing enforcement agency. And what that means is we were designed to combat discriminatory housing, so that anytime someone felt that they were discriminated against in housing, either rental, home ownership, any kind of dwelling place based on race, color, national origin, religion, religion, gender, now veteran status, source of income, sexual orientation, gender identity, our job is to investigate those claims. And sometimes, we will litigate those and either, bring that landlord or group of landlords, to court around like their discriminatory practices as well. And so we are in charge of enforcing in terms of the fair housing law, but also the Virginia Fair Housing Office is also an entity that is charged with enforcing to make sure that fair housing law is being followed. And what are the consequences for those who continue to include discriminatory language and policy? I mean, I think a lot of in our case, they're sued, and I mean the consequences like getting into their pockets. But I also think we've made an intentional effort to work with them to change their policies. And one quick example I'll give is we have been really involved in changing landlords' criminal history policy, because what we found was landlords were literally saying, if you committed a crime, 90 years ago, there's no way we're going to look at you, right? We're not going to look at you for housing. But as you can imagine, because African Americans and Latinos are overrepresented in our criminal justice system, that had a disproportionate impact on those people looking for housing. And so that was a policy that was on the books. And so we've worked with landlords to change their policies to something that's like, if it is a nonviolent offense, if you have not done that in 7 years, I think you have not been charged with a crime in 7 years, then we ought not look back 90 years. So it's policies like that oftentimes that, we'll either work with landlords or, always working with like localities and jurisdictions to make sure that they are doing things to combat housing discrimination. Can we we do on an individual level? How can we make a difference? How can we get involved? Are there certain programs, initiatives, persons to contact? I'm so glad you asked that, Adrian, because I if I have permission to Chelsea, I would actually like to send around a link that talks a little bit about testing. So one of the things that we do, okay, great. One of the things we do as an organization is that we test, and that is essentially secret shopping in the rental market or home ownership market. And so what we'll do is we will say, you know, and you're trained to be a tester, but you'll have like a Black person trying to get housing and then say a white person try to get housing. And what we'll do is we will compare the results of those two tests to see if, say, the Black homeowner or person trying to get housing receives different treatments than the white homeowner or renter. And so we are always looking to increase our testing pool. And so I'm going to share a link, and I think I can do it in here, a link in the chat for you all to, if you are interested in doing that and you do get paid for your testing, you do have to go through a pretty extensive training. We have a really awesome staff to do that. So that is one of the ways that you can directly get involved, because a lot of times those results, we can go to court on them depending on kind of what we find. So they're really, really important for the work that we do. So thank you for asking that.